Years ago, at least a couple decades ago, I went back into a graduate program to study conflict resolution. It was called Conflict Resolution and Peace Studies. The program was essentially about mediation and other non-court remedies for arguments. But it was much broader than that. And essentially the training was to train graduate students to be able to train others to be mediators, arbitrators, and conflict resolution specialists. Back then, the whole idea of arbitration and mediation was a great new thing that everybody wanted to participate in, and it was a magic pill as far as a lot of people were concerned. One of the things I found out after a few years of study was that real mediation is not very effective unless it is time consuming. And I studied some how the federal courts proposed to use the services of a trained mediator, and it was more or less like what the bankruptcy courts do in a cram down. The mediator decides which way he wants to go and then pressures one of the parties to agree somehow one way or another by counseling techniques, manipulating techniques, psychological warfare techniques, or whatever to get the result. And the purpose isn't to resolve conflict between individuals, but to cut down the backlog on court dockets so they can cram through more cases more efficiently without having to bother with such things as doing justice. I also was a peer reviewer for a publication called the International Journal for Drug Policy, and I reviewed articles submitted by researchers from all over the world. And one of the things that really struck me to begin with was the ways in which research methodology varied from country to country. Most countries from which the articles I reviewed came had a spelled out policy of fact-based legislation, or at least evidence-based legislation. That's lacking in this country. Instead, here we have propaganda-based or public relations-based policy. I just noticed an article about a colleague that was advertising that he could do something for DUI cases. That's a good example of the propaganda-based policy. And it even got worse when they started enforcing or enacting legislation and policy regarding marijuana, because they started writing tickets for driving under the influence of marijuana. Well, actually, it was driving under the influence of drugs, but particularly it applied to marijuana because other drugs were too difficult to examine. And then to go along with that scam, they set up a phony group through the National Transportation and Safety Board of how to train drug recognition experts. And this was even worse than training the conflict resolution experts, because there was no evidence-based training at all. Most of the training was based on what they call anecdotal evidence rather than real evidence. Not only that, the so-called expert prepared by NTSB and other groups within the government presented false testimony, false evidence, and a few of the instructors didn't even have chemistry degrees. One even got kicked out of office in Colorado for falsifying reports and having bias against the citizenry and for the police and used to go back to the laboratory and brag to her colleagues about how she screwed this defense attorney or that defense attorney or this public defender, and how she supported the police because that was the politically correct thing to do, I suppose. I don't know how she rationalized doctoring reports, but anyway, she lost her job. However, instead of correcting the lab and the personnel in the lab, what the state of Colorado did at that time is farm the chemistry and forensic analysis out to commercialized, privatized labs that were really clandestine as far as discovery of how they trained their personnel or operated or anything else that was really relevant. So what happens is, instead of having evidence of when a person becomes impaired or under the influence or whatever, the politicians meet with the Department of, or the District Attorneys Association and the Attorney Generals and various other political hacks, and decide on what a reasonable line would be for percentage of either alcohol or marijuana in one's system so that they could be charged. Now, I believe that the reason that there's no evidence-based or evidence needed for this legislation has nothing to do with public safety whatsoever. It has to do with laziness of officials and the fact that the courts have turned into revenue generators. So let's see what happens with the average driving under the influence of alcohol case, for instance. First off, the person is arrested. He's given a breath test, a blood test, a urine test, and if he loses, he's charged for that, even though there's budget provisions for those tests. That's recouping some of the tests. So here you're getting violated because the legislature says this is more important than your 4th, 5th, or 6th Amendment rights, and then you got to pay for the violation. That's like adding salt to a wound or insult to injury. Then what happens is you get subjected to generally weekly breathalyzers or some other thing such as that before you're convicted even. You have to take piss tests or breath tests to show that you're not cheating. That's preventative detention, and that's been unconstitutional or illegal for a state to do ever since the Magna Carta. But since we have lobby groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving who don't give a shit about evidence or anything else but want to have a political agenda recognized by the politicians, this is what they come up with. And I think it's as criminal as anything I've seen. The real criminality about it is the legislators and other policymakers don't have the guts to stand up to these pressure groups and say, well, what's the evidence? Show me the evidence. Instead, rather than contest it or even have a public hearing on the decision making, they don't want to buck the policy groups. They don't want to buck the lobby groups. They don't want to buck the people that have some political influence because it might cost them their re-election. The courts are so pussy-whipped and recruited by way of propaganda and political beliefs that they think their job is to rubber stamp governmental decisions and act as revenue agents, at least in the traffic arena. It occurred to me many, many years ago that one of the things to correct the situation or make it honest was to have a rule or constitutional amendment that all funds collected by any agency should be turned over to the general fund for distribution. Instead, what we've done is we've licensed a bunch of privateers or at least like the Admiralty did in England, where we gave them grants to go out and prey on citizens and garner what they can as far as funds or contraband, and then split the proceeds with the sovereign. That's the state we're in now. So we don't get research, we don't make policy based on research. What policy formulation is done is in the basis of propaganda and political pressure groups rather than hard evidence or hard science. One of the reasons I'm commenting on this has been a pet peeve of mine for ages. But now what we've got is we've got an administration, a national administration, that totally denies science and is willing to do anything to placate a certain segment of the population. I ask you, where is democracy there? Where is participatory government? It's not there. It's arbitrary rule, and it's ruled by whatever group has the most money or is the most vocal. And it's wrong, and I think it's time that we should do something about it. And if not do something about it, at least recognize what's going on. And I think it's time to hold our public officials and our legislators accountable, hold their feet to the fire. If they don't have enough guts to speak out against the lobby groups, kick them out of office. They don't deserve to be in office. Years and years ago, when I first started practicing law, and this was about a half century ago actually, more than that, I got on a committee to work on revision of the Colorado Criminal Code. And I was really excited and flattered that I got appointed to this commission. And being a young lawyer, I was real eager and everything. So we go to the meeting, and a former judge on the Colorado Supreme Court was in charge of the revision. And we get to the meeting, and he has a bunch of things he's going to pass out, a bunch of documents, papers. And he passes them out, and he says, "Well, boys, let me introduce you to your new criminal code." Now, we thought we were going to go there to discuss things, make compromises, and work like any other types of experts would, or any kind of a panel would. Instead, we were presented with a fait accompli, and was presented as, well, we got to rubber stamp this, and then our job is done. Well, there's an old crusty lawyer named C.J. Berardini, who was about the same age and status of the retired judge. And he got up and he said, "In all due respects, Mr. Justice, I'm not anybody's rubber stamp." And he walked out of the meeting. Well, a lot of the defense lawyers walked out also, leaving only prosecutors. Well, that was politically harmful to the administration because they wanted to say there was some sort of consensus. So they begged and cajoled, and some of us came back. And we worked for a year working out compromises to the criminal code. And after spending a year doing that, it got presented to the legislature. The DA's Association and the Attorney General's Association came in and got every compromise that we'd worked on for over a year knocked out of the final draft of the bill. So it started out the same as it did over a year ago. I don't believe this is democracy. I don't believe this is a Republican form of government. In my estimation, it's dictatorial, and it's a take it or leave it thing. And it reminds me of the bullies on the playground. Now, this has probably influenced my decision making and my ideas on things over the last 50 years as a defense attorney. And I'm really not a defense attorney as such. They've called me defense attorney or drug attorney. Instead, I view myself as a constitutional lawyer, a constitutional attorney, because most of my decisions are based upon whether or not something is constitutional. As far as individuals are concerned, I could care less. I like my clients, I do the best job I can, but as far as the big picture is concerned, I think the society and the rights and privileges of citizenry and of the populace in general is more important. I don't think that justice and democracy and efficiency exist together. I think they are mutually exclusive terms. And I think it's time the citizenry start recognizing that and start participating while they still have the ability to do so. And this is May 1st, 2020, and I hope you enjoyed my comments. And please communicate your praise or wrath to me, because I'm anxious to see what happens or hear what happens. Here's till I hear from you. Signing off, Dennis.